Tonight,
we need to do everything in our power to protect our allies and the United States from the Iranian threat.
all eyes on Iran as tensions rise in the Middle East ahead of Ramadan. The latest on how the U.S. is working to prevent a regional war. Plus, the end of a historic run.
It's time for the next generation of leadership.
Mitch McConnell will step down as the G.O.P. Senate leader this November. And
this is something that God is doing supernaturally, and he's bringing people to revival.
Franklin Graham takes the gospel to families on both sides of the southern border. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. The families of Israeli hostages take to the streets to save their loved ones. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. 145 days after their relatives were kidnapped from Israel, today hostages' families kicked off a 4-day Middle East march. The goal is to highlight the hardships their loved ones have faced since being snatched by Hamas terrorists on October 7th. The group is making their way from southern Israel to Jerusalem, calling on leaders to reach an agreement to free hostages.
No one can be left behind, the living and the murdered. The War Cabinet is responsible for ensuring that the current deal, all the hostages will be included. We cannot agree to leave any sector behind. No one should be left behind. The state of Israel cannot be fully restored without securing the release of all the hostages.
Despite the march, hope for a quick hostage negotiation is fading. President Biden suggested yesterday we could see something in place by the end of this week. But today, Hamas officials said there's still a wide gap between them and Israeli leaders. As the war wages on, the threat of Iran hovers over a tense Middle East. Tehran continues to fund proxies in the region. Senators on the Foreign Relations Committee put the issue front and center today on Capitol Hill. Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka joins us now with more on that. Matt?
Well, Jenna, Iran remains a destabilizing force in the Middle East as Israel continues to try and eradicate Hamas. Avoiding a larger conflict continues to be the goal from the United States, but figuring out exactly how to do that remains tricky.
From Syria to Yemen to Iraq to Lebanon, Iranian proxies are a serious, lethal threat to our allies globally, to our partners in the region, and the United States' national security interests.
The Iranian regime has influence over multiple terrorist groups across the Middle East. The Israeli defense minister warns they plan on using Ramadan to execute more terror attacks around Israel, using Hamas and Hezbollah to carry out attacks in the region. Iranian-backed proxies have already carried out dozens of attacks on U.S. forces since October, including one that killed 3 service members. The U.S. responded with strikes to Iranian-backed targets. Those strikes have reportedly caused Iran to scale back their attacks in the region.
They recognize that they're outmatched by the United States and by Israel, and so that they're very hesitant to get into a direct conflict, but they will push the envelope because they presume that our willingness to push back is less than theirs.
Republicans are critical of how the Biden administration has dealt with Iran, including unfreezing cash assets in return for hostages and the potential return to a nuclear deal.
As Iran marches across the Middle East, the Biden administration has still not articulated a coherent Iran policy outside of the nuclear negotiations. It's time to change course.
I find it unfortunate that we don't have a member of the administration here. I'd like to understand the logic for their current position, how it may have changed, what their views are for going forward. It's helpful to hear from experts such as yourselves, but you raise questions that really need to be responded to by the current administration.
On Capitol Hill, former special envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, told senators more crippling sanctions are needed to secure the region.
Money is the sinews of war. Iran understands that. If you don't go after the money, it's not a serious strategy.
Now, Hook has been the target of Iranian threats since his time in the Trump administration, and he continues to have government security. The Islamic holy month of Ramadan starts in less than 2 weeks, and its kickoff is viewed by some as an unofficial deadline for a potential hostage exchange and ceasefire. Jenna?
All right, Matt, thank you. Meanwhile, Congress is facing down another possible government shutdown. Negotiations are underway to come up with a plan before midnight Friday. But as of now, no deal. Abigail Robertson is on Capitol Hill tonight as the clock ticks down. Abigail, is there any optimism lawmakers can get this done in time?
Yes, Jenna, there is a great deal of optimism here on the Hill, and the message today coming from Speaker of the House Mike Johnson is we're not going to shut the government down, but it is still up in the air how they are going to avoid doing that. And while both sides believe that they can get something done, yesterday House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries left the White House saying that the solution may just be temporary. Take a look.
It may be important to come to an agreement that's bipartisan and anchored in common sense to extend the pending expiration of the 8 additional bills that are scheduled to lapse on March 8th so that good faith, tough negotiations can continue in the absence of a government shutdown.
And even if the solution is short-lived, as I said, it does seem that there is strong bipartisan agreement that they can pass something to avoid the shutdown.
Abigail, come Friday, break down what does happen in terms of closures or who doesn't have a paycheck. What shuts down?
Well, if we see a partial shutdown could happen on Friday, and it would affect 20% of government agencies, and then the other 80% of government agencies could shut down a week later on March 8th when their funding expires. Now, the first agencies affected would be agriculture, energy, transportation, housing and urban development, and Veterans Affairs. And if we see this partial shutdown on Friday, then more than 100,000 federal employees would immediately be furloughed, and essential employees like service members and air traffic controllers would be forced to go to work without pay. And another notable group that would be affected by this partial shutdown on Friday would be people who are benefits of 2 major food assistance programs under the Department of Agriculture. So it would be a big deal, and especially if they don't pass something next week as well.
Absolutely. Abby, a major announcement on Capitol Hill today. Mitch McConnell will step down as GOP leader come November. What was his message today?
Well, today he gave an emotional speech on the Senate floor reflecting on his 40-year career in the Senate, but he acknowledged that his time has come, that he's not as young as he once was, and he quoted the Bible in speaking to why he's decided that it's time for him to move on. Take a look.
As Ecclesiastes tells us, to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven. To serve Kentucky in the Senate has been the honor of my life. To lead my Republican colleagues has been the highest privilege. But one of life's most underappreciated talents is to know when it's time to move on to life's next chapter.
McConnell has served as the Senate's top Republican for 17 years, making him the longest-serving Senate party leader in the Senate's history. Jenna?
All right, a legendary career. Abigail Robertson on Capitol Hill tonight. Thank you, Abigail. Well, turning to the 2024 race for the White House, voters in Michigan sending a clear message to President Biden in last night's primary. While 81% of Democratic voters picked the president, around 13% marked uncommitted on their primary ballots, a move meant to protest Biden's support of Israeli military action. As the war against Hamas continues, the push in Michigan is now expected to spread to other states ahead of Super Tuesday. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, former President Donald Trump topped rival Nikki Haley, picking up 15 more delegates in his quest to secure the Republican nomination. Senator Scott, welcome. So let's start with your endorsement of former President Trump and why you chose him over fellow South Carolinian Nikki Haley.
You know, it's kind of a simple answer, to be honest with you. There's no doubt that President Trump had 4 amazing years from a policy perspective. You think about what he did for the country. He united the country because success begets success. We have the lowest unemployment rates for African Americans, for Hispanics, for Asians, a 70-year low for women, and a 50-year low for the majority population. Those kinds of numbers actually brings America together. In addition to that, we saw the fastest wage growth at the bottom of the income. That's great news for everyday working Americans who are working paycheck to paycheck, trying to pay their bills. But even beyond that, you think about things that are really important to families, like education. President Trump put the most money in HBCUs in the history of the country at the time.
Senator, do you think it's time for Nikki Haley to get out of the race?
Oh, I think it's past time for Nikki to get out of the race. Listen, she was a good governor, and we thank her for her service, but the best thing she can do for the future of the country right now is to get out of the race so that this race becomes between President Trump and Joe Biden.
Your name is being talked about a lot as a possible running mate for the former president. What conversations, Senator, have you had with Trump about the possibility of being his running mate?
I've said to the president something very clear. I'm not going to ask you for anything specific. What I will tell you, Mr. President, is that whatever it takes to get you across the finish line, count me in for a couple of reasons. Number one, America is better off with 4 more years of Donald Trump and no more years of Joe Biden. I've said very clearly that the mission of accomplishing the goal of 4 more years is far more important than the position that might be something I would seek.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on McConnell stepping down as the Senate Republican leader in November. Anything you might add to that?
You know, we always thank Senator McConnell for his service. Certainly, he has served this nation he's the longest standing leader in America's history. What we need to continue to do is make sure that we have 4 more years of Donald Trump, win the majority back in the Senate, actually hold on to the majority in the House, and then go to work with our new leaders with a strong agenda focused on the American people.
Senator, when it comes to a potential shutdown, do you see a path forward for a deal to keep the government running?
Well, the good news is my understanding of the 4 corners, we call that the Speaker, the Minority Leader, the Leader of the Senate, and the Minority Leader in the Senate. Those 4 folks have been meeting and having a serious conversation that it looks like we will avoid a government shutdown. That's good news.
Today, you tweeted, this is a quote, "Here's a dose of reality. Our border is wide open and American lives are at risk because of the president, but the president refuses to enforce the laws on the books." What steps, Senator, would you like to see the president take to secure the border?
Well, the most important step President Biden could do to secure our border is to do what President Trump already did. He started building a border wall. A large physical impediment reduces the number of illegal crossings. I was just in Eagle Pass, Texas, less than 10 days ago. And one of the things that the Border Patrol agents told me was the importance of having a physical impediment. That plus the Remain in Mexico policy are 2 things that the current president could do right now to close our southern border. And let's use all the technology already available and sometimes rusting in shelters near the border. If we just did those 3 things, we could reduce precipitously the number of illegal crossings. And in addition to that, 70,000 Americans who've lost their lives to fentanyl could still be alive if we had a closed southern border. This should be a priority for any administration.
And finally, Senator, new Gallup polling shows only 13% of Americans approve of the job Congress is doing. Can you understand that and the frustration, and how are you addressing that?
Well, there's no doubt that Congress has always had a pretty low approval rating, and certainly having been there for a little while, I can understand why. The good news is the fastest path to improving our ratings, frankly, do our jobs. At the end of the day, focusing on America's priorities, securing the southern border, fixing the broken economy, and restoring law and order in our country is the way for us not to simply improve our polls, but to improve the quality of life that our citizens are experiencing. That should be our objective.
All right, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, great to have you on the program. Thank you very much. Well, the High Court hears a challenge to Bumpstocks. What today's Supreme Court arguments could mean for gun owners. That's next on Faith Nation. following up tonight on government funding and a deal. Lawmakers have struck a deal to avert a shutdown. Tune into the 700 Club tomorrow for all of the details. Well, should a ban on Bumpstocks stay in place? That was the question today before the Supreme Court. Bumpstocks are gun attachments that allow automatic rifles to fire more quickly. A Trump-era law banned them. Some gun owners have expressed concern over what that means for them. Today, the justices heard arguments that the ban should remain.
It would be horribly unfair to prosecute people who possess these devices in reliance on the agency's past assurance, but that is taken care of through doctrines like entrapment by estoppel, which ensure that no one has been and no one will be prosecuted for possessing these guns these devices during a time when ATF said it was legal. But that's not a reason to shackle the ATF, and certainly not a reason to shackle this court to adopt something other than the best reading of the words Congress wrote.
And here with us now is Amy Swear, legal fellow at the Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Amy, welcome. So the arguments heard before the court today were not a challenge to the Second Amendment, but could have a big impact on gun owners. What's at stake here? And also, what's your sense on how the court is leaning?
Sure. So this is certainly something that could affect as many as 500,000 gun owners who owned these devices prior to 2017, when the ATF changed its mind after several decades and said, no, these devices actually do constitute machine guns. They've always constituted machine guns, and now you have to get rid of them. And so you're right. This is not actually a question of whether or not these devices or any type of firearm is protected under the Second Amendment. It's a question of who gets to decide whether or not these devices constitute a machine gun. So like I said, for many decades, the ATF had said these are not machine guns. They don't turn a semi-automatic firearm into a machine gun. And then after the Las Vegas shooting in 2017, they went through an administrative process, not to change the text of the law, because that would have to be done by Congress, but to change their interpretation to say, actually, these are machine guns. And so it's a matter of whether or not that interpretation is consistent with the text of the statute, or whether this was the ATF sort of arbitrarily rewriting federal law in a way that only would have been appropriate for Congress. And in fact, Congress has tried at points in the past to enact laws similar to what the ATF is trying to do. But again, it's sort of the administrative issue of who gets to determine whether or not these are actually machine guns and how that process must be implemented.
So the Biden administration is urging the court to uphold a bump stock ban. Just last month, the White House issued an executive order on gun storage in an effort to cut back on gun violence. What's your take on how the administration is handling this issue?
So this has been something that the administration from the very beginning has said we are going to try to do as much as we can from an administrative standpoint to crack down on gun violence, to sort of expand gun control from a federal standpoint, even if Congress is not going to act. This obviously with the bump stock ban, this started under a previous administration, but it is certainly something that they are defending in full. I think the Biden administration in many respects has sort of reached the end of what they can reasonably try to do without congressional action. And so I think they're finding it a bit difficult to find sort of more avenues for action within the context of what they can constitutionally accomplish, again, without Congress enacting more legislation.
Amy, we just have a few seconds left, but late last year, you testified for the Senate about gun violence and it being a public health crisis. How is it a public health issue and not a weapon issue?
Well, I think, if anything, this framing of it being a public health crisis is actually trying to get it away from sort of constitutional conflicts that come up. It has become almost manipulative in the sense of, I think everybody recognizes there is a public health instance when people are dying from whatever means. That is problematic. But I think the reframing is almost a cynical attempt to take it out of the framework of constitutional rights and sort of use it as an excuse to roll over those rights and sort of sidestep the constitutional aspects. And I think that's unfortunate, because this is a very serious issue, but you can't just ignore the constitutional realities.
Yeah. All right, Amy, we are out of time, unfortunately, but it's great to see you. Thank you so much. Amy Swear with the Heritage Foundation. Have a great night.
Thank you.
And up next, bringing the gospel to border communities, how some are working to bring hope amid a humanitarian crisis. bringing hope to the border. Tonight, Franklin Graham will preach in Eagle Pass, Texas, as part of an evangelistic tour along the southern border. Graham says he's not talking politics. He's sharing the good news with a region that's hurting. Heather Sells is in Eagle Pass with this report.
This evangelistic tour focuses on 10 border cities, including right here in Eagle Pass, one of the hot spots over the last several years. Franklin Graham told CBN News that God has placed a burden on his heart for this region and that he intends to preach the good news to everyone, regardless of whether they're from the U.S., Mexico, or another country. The tour started in Brownsville, Texas, and will finish along the border in California. Pastors here in Eagle Pass say people here are struggling and they are praying for an abundant harvest.
As believers, as we're praying and asking God for revival, we are seeing that shift in the atmosphere. We are seeing things change and move.
This is something that God is doing supernaturally, and he's bringing people to revival. He's bringing people back to Christ, and we're living in an amazing time right now. It's phenomenal that you see this whole thing culminating right here, right now in Eagle Pass, Texas.
Pastors and lay leaders here have been preparing for this event for months and say they are ready to follow up with anyone who makes a decision for Christ. Reporting in Eagle Pass, Texas, Heather Sells, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Heather. And still ahead, a generous gift that keeps on giving for generations. Finally tonight, the gift of a lifetime. Students at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine got some very welcome news this week. The New York City Medical School will be tuition-free from now on, thanks to a $1 billion donation from a former professor. Ruth Goetzman, the widow of a Wall Street investor, announced the gift, bringing some to their feet, others to tears. The 93-year-old says she hopes the gift attracts applicants who otherwise couldn't afford to attend. And that's going to do it for Faith Nation this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great night, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.